My name is Elliot. I am, or was, the kind of man who notices when the coffee is low before anyone else does, who rotates the car tires without being asked, who leaves the last piece of bread for his wife because he has always assumed her hunger matters more than his own. I have spent 7 years being quietly, invisibly useful in a marriage that treated usefulness like furniture. Essential but unremarkable, something you only notice when it breaks. Renata was beautiful in the way that expensive hotels are beautiful. Perfectly lit, impeccably arranged, and somehow inhospitable if you lingered too long. She had built a career in corporate communications with the same deliberate artistry she applied to her appearance. Every word curated, every image managed, every impression controlled. People admired her. Colleagues deferred to her. Strangers at parties leaned in when she spoke. I was proud of that once. I told myself that her success was partly mine, that the dinners I cooked and the laundry I folded and the silence I maintained during her conference calls were a kind of invisible architecture holding up something magnificent. The party was a Friday evening in late September. Her company had rented a rooftop venue downtown, the kind of place with Edison bulbs strung between steel beams and a view of the city that made everyone feel temporarily important. Renata had been preparing since Tuesday. New dress, deep burgundy, tailored at the waist. Hair blown straight. A practiced laugh she kept polished like silverware only brought out for guests. I wore my good navy jacket. I thought I looked fine. She looked at me when I came downstairs and said nothing, which I had learned to interpret as acceptable. At the party, she moved through the crowd the way water moves through a landscape, effortlessly, following the paths of least resistance, always finding the most interesting terrain. I trailed behind her for the first 20 minutes before quietly accepting that I was not meant to trail. I was meant to stand somewhere pleasant and not require anything. So I found a spot near the bar, ordered a club soda, and watched her work the room. She didn't introduce me to a single person for the first hour. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the man she kept gravitating toward, Marcus, her deputy head of strategy, a man whose confidence occupied a room the way expensive cologne does, pervasive, self-assured, slightly too much. He was tall, classically handsome, the kind of face that belongs in an advertisement for watches or private banking. He made her laugh with her whole body, not the curated laugh she wore like jewelry, but something looser, younger, more real. I noticed. I filed it away. I kept noticing. Around 9 o'clock, someone at the long table near the railing suggested I should join them. A colleague of Renata's, a friendly woman named Priya, made space and said warmly, "Your husband should sit with us." Renata smiled and said nothing. I pulled up a chair. 10 minutes later, someone at the table made a joke about charades, suggested that for entertainment we could have the spouses tell a story, and looked at me with the vague goodwill of someone trying to be inclusive. Before I could open my mouth, Renata raised her glass and said, with a bright, practiced laugh, "Trust me, don't bother." He'd put everyone to sleep. The table laughed. Not cruelly. They didn't know they were being cruel. They laughed the way people laugh at a host's joke, reflexively, obediently, because that is what the social contract demands in that moment. But I heard it differently. I heard 7 years of small silences landing in one sentence. 7 years of being the background. 7 years of dinners cooked, plans adjusted, ambitions quietly folded and put away in drawers she never opened. And then the sound of her voice, bright and easy and absolutely certain that I would not respond, that I would absorb it the way I always absorbed everything, that I would smile and look at my drink and let it pass. I did not let it pass. I set down my glass, stood up slowly, and looked directly at her. The table had already started moving on. I said, clearly enough for the people nearest us to hear, "Boring is spending 7 years making sure you never had to be." Then I put on my jacket and walked to the elevator. No storming, no performance, no waiting to see her face. I pressed the button, the doors opened, and I left. On the street below, the city was loud and indifferent, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to relief. I didn't know yet what that sentence would cost her. I only knew what it had just given me back. What makes Elliot's story so psychologically precise is not the moment of public humiliation itself, but the infrastructure of silence that made it possible. The comment Renata made at the table, "Don't bother, he'd put everyone to sleep," was not an isolated cruelty. It was the visible tip of a pattern so deeply embedded in the relationship's architecture that neither partner may have consciously recognized it until that moment. Elliot exhibits what psychologists call accommodation creep, the gradual, incremental adjustment of one's own needs, expression, and identity in order to maintain relational harmony. Each individual concession, the silence during her calls, the meals cooked without acknowledgement, the social invisibility accepted at parties, was small enough to rationalize. Together, they had built a boundary so eroded that Renata could publicly diminish him in front of colleagues and expect no consequence. She had been trained to expect no consequence because there never had been one. The most revealing detail is not what Renata said, but that she said it without hesitation. There was no internal calculation, no flicker of consideration. This suggests the dynamic was so normalized for her that she genuinely did not register it as an act of cruelty. She was not being strategically unkind. She was simply operating within the established rules of their relationship, rules that Elliot had quietly ratified through years of compliance. His departure, calm, unhurried, dignified, represents the first boundary he had enforced in years. Not a demand, not an ultimatum. A simple, irreversible act of self-respect. The psychological significance of this cannot be overstated. For people who have spent years in accommodating roles, the first act of genuine boundary setting often does not feel like anger. It feels, as Elliot notes, like relief. That relief is the body recognizing that something true has finally been said. I slept on the couch that night. Not because she asked me to, she hadn't come home, but because the bedroom felt like a room I had been renting under a false name, and I needed to think about whether to renew the lease. I woke at 6, as I always do, to the gray particular quiet of Saturday morning. The apartment had the specific stillness of a space from which one person has recently departed and another has not yet decided what to do next. Her coffee mug from Thursday was still in the drying rack. Her reading glasses were on the kitchen counter. Her tablet was on the coffee table, screen dark. I made coffee. I sat with it. I told myself I was not going to look at the tablet. I looked at the tablet. There was no password. She had always said, when the subject came up in the abstract, between friends, as a hypothetical about trust, that she had nothing to hide and therefore saw no reason for one. I had admired that then. Standing in my kitchen holding a mug I had bought on a trip we took to Vermont 3 years ago, I understood it differently. The absence of a password was not openness. It was confidence. She had never imagined I would look. The calendar was still open from whatever she had been doing before the party. The interface was color-coded, her whole life organized in overlapping blocks of blue and green and gray. But there were entries in a different color, a darker teal she used, I would later realize, for personal appointments she wanted distinguished from professional ones. That color told a story. Friday, dinner, M. Reservations at Olio, 8 p.m. Saturday, M's, overnight. Back Sunday afternoon. Tuesday, lunch, usual place. At the bottom of one entry, almost casual, a note to herself. Delete this later. She had not deleted it. I put the mug down carefully. Then I opened her messages. His name in her contacts was simply M. The conversation stretched back 11 months. It was not what I had imagined infidelity would look like. No declarations, no passion, no anguished poetry of a secret love. It was domestic, comfortable, organized in the way that a second life, fully established, becomes routine. Running 15-minute late. Save me the window seat. Did you remember the hotel points card this time? My husband made that pasta thing again. You would have hated it. That last one had 3 laughing emojis beneath it. His reply, your husband and his little projects. At least someone's keeping busy. My husband and his little projects. I read that 3 times. I set the tablet face down on the coffee table and sat very still for approximately 2 minutes, watching the morning light move across the floorboards. Then I picked it up again, because I needed to understand the full geometry of what I was looking at. What I found, reading back through 11 months of messages, was not a love affair. It was a parallel arrangement, functional, occasionally affectionate, mostly convenient. Renata appeared in it as a sharper, more sardonic version of herself, one who found my domestic efforts faintly ridiculous, who referred to me in shorthand as E or, occasionally, the chef, a reference I eventually understood. 6 months ago, I had gone through a phase of photographing dinners I was particularly proud of and sending them to her when she worked late. I had wanted her to feel thought of. She had apparently shared those photographs with Marcus, and they had laughed about them together. Chef Elliot strikes again, she had written, attaching a photo I had sent of a mushroom risotto. Tonight, artisan grains for one. Tell him to open a restaurant, Marcus had replied. At least then it would be useful. I closed the tablet. I stood up and went to the window. 7 floors below, the street was waking up in its ordinary Saturday way. A man walking a dog, a cyclist in fluorescent yellow, a woman pushing a pram into the thin autumn sunlight. All of them living in worlds where the ground was solid beneath their feet. I had 2 options. I could react from the wound, the hot, immediate instinct to call, confront, collapse, or explode. Or I could understand, with the calm that sometimes arrives precisely when things become catastrophically clear, that I was not actually surprised. That some part of me had known the shape of this thing for a long time and had simply declined to look at it directly. The grief was real. I want to be honest about that. There was genuine grief for the version of my marriage I had believed in, for the effort I had made that had been redirected into someone else's entertainment. But underneath the grief was something harder and more useful. Clarity. The kind that arrives not like a thunderclap, but like the moment your eyes adjust to darkness and you see the room for what it actually is. I made a second cup of coffee. I opened my laptop. I began making notes. The discovery at this stage operates on 2 levels simultaneously. There is the surface revelation of the affair, and then there is the deeper, more psychologically complex revelation about the nature of Renata's self-deception and Elliot's own. Renata's absence of a password is a masterclass in a cognitive bias known as optimism bias combined with contempt. She genuinely did not believe Elliot would look, not because she trusted him completely, but because she had unconsciously ranked him as someone too passive, too accommodating, too invested in the comfort of not knowing to ever disturb the arrangement. Her confidence was not about love or transparency. It was a risk calculation, one that had worked for 11 months and had therefore been quietly upgraded in her mind to an established fact. He will not look. This is compounded by another phenomenon, compartmentalization as identity management. Renata did not experience herself as a person doing something wrong. She experienced herself as a person managing 2 separate contexts, each with its own emotional logic. In one context, she was the high-achieving professional with a sharp, funny, sophisticated inner life that Marcus reflected back at her. In another, she was a wife, a role that had gradually been drained of meaning but retained its social and logistical utility. Elliot, in her internal architecture, had become associated entirely with the second context. He was not a person she was betraying. He was an arrangement she was quietly transcending. What makes this psychologically devastating and ultimately self-defeating is the shared mockery. Using Elliot's small acts of love as material for intimacy with another man is not merely infidelity. It is a form of identity erasure. She took the evidence of his care and converted it into proof of his inadequacy. This is a hallmark of contempt, which relationship researchers identify as one of the most reliable predictors of relational collapse, because it signals the complete dissolution of positive regard for the partner as a human being. Elliot's response, stillness, note-taking, deliberate thinking rather than reactive explosion, signals a psychological shift that is rare and significant. He does not disassociate or collapse. He observes. This is the beginning of reclaiming agency. She came back Sunday afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, reading. She came in looking slightly windswept and freshly composed. The way someone looks when they have applied a careful layer of normalcy over something they prefer not to examine. Her eyes swept the apartment with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing risk. They landed on my face. I looked up. I said nothing. She said, "Hey." Casual. Controlled. I said, "How was the weekend?" A half-second pause. "Fine." Quiet. I stayed at Prius, needed to decompress after Friday. She hung her bag on the hook by the door, the hook I had installed 2 years ago, because she said she always lost her keys. "Look, about Friday, I think you overreacted. It was a joke. Everyone jokes like that at parties. Everyone jokes like that about their husband in front of his colleagues." "My colleagues, Elliot." "My party." "Right," I said, and returned to my book. She waited for more. When there wasn't any, she went to the kitchen, made herself a coffee, and disappeared into her home office. I heard the familiar click of her door and the muffled cadence of a phone call beginning. I made notes. Over the next 5 days, I operated with a deliberateness that surprised me. I had never thought of myself as a strategic person. That had always been her domain. But I discovered that strategic thinking is simply a matter of seeing clearly and then deciding, step by step, what order the steps belong in. The first step was a lawyer. I found one through a friend's recommendation, a quiet, efficient woman named Patricia who specialized in asset division and who listened to everything I said without once looking at her phone. "You want this to be clean," she said, after I had finished. "I want it to be fair," I said, "and I want it to be done." She nodded. "Those aren't incompatible." The second step was documentation. Not out of vengeance. I want to be clear about that, even now. Documentation as record, as accuracy. I printed the calendar. I noted dates. I organized what I had seen with the same methodical care I had always applied to everything else in that apartment. The same care that had apparently been, for 11 months, the subject of private comedy. The third step was the party. Our 8th anniversary was the following Friday. We had loosely planned something. The way you loosely plan things in a marriage that has stopped communicating in specifics, and I decided to actualize it. I called her parents. I called mine. I called her closest friends, including Priya, who sounded slightly uncomfortable when I called but agreed to come. I called 6 of her colleagues. I booked a caterer. I sent a message to Marcus's personal number, which I had found in Renata's contacts, that read simply, "Anniversary drinks, Friday, 7 p.m. Address attached. Hope you can make it." He replied with a thumbs up. When I told Renata I had organized an anniversary party, her reaction was a microsecond of something she immediately suppressed. I saw it. She was good at suppression, but I had been watching her face for 7 years. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted to," I said truthfully. "I wanted to celebrate properly." She studied me. "This feels like effort, like investment." I smiled. "You're right. It is." She did not push further. She probably thought I was mounting a campaign of reconciliation, a grand domestic gesture to paper over Friday. She had misread me before. She would not have the opportunity to do it again. Meanwhile, during those 5 days, something else was happening. Something quieter, something that had nothing to do with Renata at all. 3 years ago, before the marriage had fully calcified into its present form, I had been a graphic novelist in the margins of my life. Not professionally. I had a job in UX design that I was competent at and largely indifferent to. But in the evenings, in the hours when Renata worked late or traveled, I had been building something. A long-form illustrated story about a city that exists in the negative space between other cities, a place you arrive in by accident and leave by an act of will. I had 200 pages finished. Then Renata had read a draft one evening. She had found it on the shared desktop and said, with genuine bewilderment, "What is this for?" I had not worked on it since. On Wednesday evening, I opened the file. I read what I had written. It was good. Not perfect, not finished, but alive in a way that the rest of my week was not. I kept reading until 2 in the morning. Then I opened a new document and kept going. Here is where the story's psychological center of gravity shifts decisively. Elliot moves from reactive discovery to proactive design, and understanding what drives that shift requires looking carefully at the emotional substrate beneath the practical actions. The key psychological event in this section is not the legal consultation or the party planning. It is the moment Elliot reopens his graphic novel at 2 in the morning. This is the story's most quietly significant action because it reveals what the marriage had actually cost him. Not just peace, not just dignity, but the continuous thread of his own creative identity. Renata's single dismissive question, "What is this for?" had been sufficient to close a 200-page door. This is a chilling illustration of how contempt, even expressed mildly and briefly, can produce lasting self-silencing in a partner who has been psychologically conditioned to absorb rather than resist. The party plan is often misread as revenge, but Elliot is explicit that it is not, and there is psychological evidence to support him. Revenge is hot, reactive, and fundamentally oriented toward the other person. What Elliot is doing is witnessing. He is arranging for the truth to be visible to the people it concerns, her parents, his parents, their social world. Not to wound her, but because he has concluded that he is no longer willing to be the co-author of a fiction. This distinction matters clinically. It is the difference between an act of destruction and an act of disclosure. Renata's suppressed reaction when he mentions the party is also psychologically revealing. Her discomfort is not guilt, not yet. It is the discomfort of a person whose carefully managed environment has produced an unexpected variable. She is a communications professional. Uncontrolled events, unscripted moments, gatherings she has not curated. These are genuine threats to her sense of self. Elliot, perhaps for the first time, has placed something in her environment that she cannot edit. His emotional state during these 5 days, methodical, calm, quietly purposeful, is characteristic of what psychologists call post-traumatic growth processing, the phase after a major relational rupture where the ego, rather than collapsing, reorganizes around a clearer sense of self. The creative work is not an escape. It is evidence that the self survived. The Friday of the party was warm for October, the kind of warmth that feels like a gift and a farewell simultaneously. I had arranged the apartment with care, flowers, candles, the good glasses, the caterer's trays arranged on the extended dining table. I wore the suit I had bought for our wedding rehearsal dinner, which still fit. I had my notes in my jacket pocket, printed on a single folded sheet of paper. Guests arrived between 7 and 7:30. Her parents, Robert and Diana, came first. Diana immediately complimenting the flowers, Robert shaking my hand with the particular warmth he had always shown me, the warmth of a man who had watched his daughter choose and had quietly approved. My mother came with my brother. Priya arrived looking cautious, eyes moving around the room with the alertness of someone who suspects the evening may not go as advertised. Marcus arrived at 7:20. He looked confident, as he always did, in dark jeans and a blazer, a bottle of wine under his arm. He shook my hand. Elliot, good to finally do this properly. He was smooth. I gave him that. Renata circulated beautifully. She was always at her best in managed social environments. Warm, funny, attentive to whoever she was speaking to. For 45 minutes, I watched her be magnificent. I wanted to remember that, too. The full picture, not just the damage. At 8 o'clock, I tapped my glass. The room quieted. Renata looked at me with a smile that was 30% genuine and 70% uncertain. Thank you all for coming tonight, I said. 8 years is worth marking. At least, the things that happen in 8 years are worth marking. I paused. I want to be honest with everyone in this room, because you are the people who were honest enough to show up. Renata and I are separating. I wanted you all to hear it from me, in person, without spin. The room went very still. Diana made a small sound. My mother reached for my brother's arm. I also want to say, I continued, that the last several years have involved a set of arrangements I was not part of. I have the evidence, dates, messages, a year's worth of a calendar I was not supposed to see, and I am not going to enumerate it in detail because some of you do not need to carry that. But I wanted you here because the version of events that will circulate after tonight is less likely to be a single managed narrative if the people who matter to both of us were present for the truth. I looked at Marcus. He had gone completely still, glass halfway to his mouth. Marcus, I said pleasantly, thank you for coming. I thought it was important you be here too. He put his glass down. He did not say anything. His jaw had tightened in a way that was almost imperceptible, almost professional. Almost, Renata said, very quietly. Elliot, stop. I am stopping, I said. I've said what I came to say. I raised my glass to the room. To honesty, which is, I have learned, one of the harder forms of kindness. Nobody cheered. Nobody needed to. The room held the moment with the particular gravity that truth, spoken plainly, tends to produce. Renata walked out. Not dramatically. She was too controlled for drama, but with the careful, rapid precision of someone who has suddenly discovered the floor is hot. Marcus followed her by about 45 seconds, and when he passed me in the doorway, he said nothing, which was the most honest thing he'd done all evening. Diana came to me and held both my hands and said only, I'm sorry. I told her there was nothing to be sorry for. My mother said nothing, just put her arms around me for a moment. Priya sat down on the sofa and looked at her wine glass for a long time. Nobody left immediately. We ate the caterer's food. We talked quietly, carefully, the way people talk in the aftermath of something significant. Someone put on music. My brother poured more wine. The evening became in its strange way, something almost tender, a small, honest gathering of people who had just been told the truth and were deciding, collectively, how to sit with it. I was the last to leave my own apartment that night. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the dark, in the smell of candles and food and the residue of a gathering, and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Myself. The anniversary party scene is where the story's central psychological drama fully materializes, and where the contrast between expectation and reality becomes most acute for every person present. Renata arrived at the party expecting one of two scenarios: either a performance of marital normalcy she could navigate with her usual social skill, or an emotional confrontation she could deflect with practiced composure. What she encountered was neither. Elliot's speech was not emotional. It was factual, spare, precise, calibrated. He offered no accusations, no visible grief, no invitation to defend herself. This was a scenario she had not rehearsed for, because it required a version of Elliot she had not believed existed. This is the perceptual chasm at the heart of the scene. Renata's model of Elliot, built over 7 years of him absorbing, accommodating, and retreating, was so thoroughly internalized that she had stopped updating it against new evidence. The man who walked out of the rooftop party without a scene had registered as anomalous, quickly rationalized as temporary. The man delivering a quiet, dignified speech to her parents and colleagues was operating entirely outside her predictive model. The result was not the anger or devastation she might have managed. It was the particular helplessness of someone whose entire strategic playbook has been rendered irrelevant. Marcus presents a different perceptual contrast. He arrived expecting to be an invisible guest at someone else's marital event, present as a person, invisible as a context. Elliot's direct acknowledgement of him was not an accusation but a naming, a refusal to pretend that the people present in the room did not include all the relevant people. Marcus's inability to speak in response is significant. He is a man who manages impressions professionally. In this moment, there is no impression to manage, because the truth has been allowed to simply stand there, uncontested. For the other guests, family, friends, colleagues, the contrast is between the polished social event they arrived for and the quietly honest gathering they found themselves in. What is striking is that nobody leaves. This speaks to something important. People respond to authentic truth with a kind of gravity and respect, even when it is uncomfortable. The fictional version of the party Renata would have curated, smooth, celebratory, controlled, would have been forgotten by Sunday. The real one will be remembered. Elliot's final moment alone in the apartment, in the dark, in the smell of candles, is a study in the restoration of selfhood. The contrast he experiences is internal. The person who stood in this room 7 years ago versus the person standing here now. Both are him. One had simply been waiting. She called at 11 that night from what I assumed was Marcus's apartment. I let it ring. She called again at midnight, and at 1 in the morning. The voicemails were short, the first 2 terse, the third something closer to frightened, though she would never have used that word. I texted back, "I'll be at the apartment Sunday to collect some things. I've already spoken to Patricia. Papers will be with you by the end of next week." She replied immediately, "You had no right to do that." I wrote back, "To be honest?" She did not respond to that. Sunday came. I arrived at 10 to find her already there, sitting at the kitchen table with the same stillness she had used on the night of the rooftop party, composed on the surface, but with something running fast beneath it that I had, finally, learned to read. Her phone was face down on the table. She had been crying, not recently, but at some point, since Friday. Her eyes had that particular clarity that comes after. "You've destroyed my career," she said, as I came in. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. "How so?" "The HR inquiry. Someone sent the—" She stopped. Started again. "Someone took a photograph at the party. There are messages circulating. Someone put it together and filed a formal complaint. Marcus is a direct report, Elliot. I manage him. There's a conduct clause." I said nothing. "You knew that," she said. "Not a question." "I didn't know his official title," I said honestly. "But I had inferred the dynamic from context." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Of course you had." She pushed back from the table. "Was any of this about me? Or was it all just—" She gestured at nothing in particular, "a project." I thought about that carefully. "It was about accuracy," I said. I was tired of being the only person in our lives who knew the real version of things. It seemed right to let other people know too. And Marcus? Inviting him. Was that accuracy? He was a relevant party. She stood up, moved to the window, and stood with her back to me for a long moment looking at the street below. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, the performance stripped out of it. Was it always going to end like this? I thought about the question honestly. I don't know when it ended. I said. I know when I noticed. She nodded, very slightly. Then she picked up her phone, her keys, and her bag, and walked out of the apartment with the particular economy of motion of someone who has decided that the next thing they need to do is be somewhere else. I stood at the window for a while after she left. The street was the same street it always was. Traffic. A woman with a pram. A cyclist. The ordinary, indifferent continuity of the world. Then I went to the desk in the second bedroom, the room that had been vaguely designated as an office but that I had always thought of as potentially a studio, and I opened my laptop. There was an email from a small publishing collective in Edinburgh that had been forwarded to me through an illustrator I'd connected with at a conference 2 years ago. They had seen some pages of my graphic novel, shared by the illustrator, apparently, and wanted to know if I was interested in a conversation about a development deal. Not a guarantee, not a contract, but a conversation, which is always where real things begin. I replied within the hour. 3 days later, I was also contacted by the HR department at Renata's company. Not as a target, as a witness. They wanted to understand the timeline of events. I cooperated fully, as I always did with anything that required accuracy. The investigation concluded 4 weeks later. Marcus was reassigned. Renata was issued a formal warning that went on her permanent professional record. She did not lose her job. She was too good at it for that, and the company was too invested in her reputation to want a full termination. But the carefully maintained image of Renata, the impeccable professional, had developed a visible crack that would take years to repair. I was not glad about that. I want to be accurate. I was not glad and I was not sorry. I was simply present to the fact that actions produce consequences, and that consequences, unlike people, are honest by nature. Meanwhile, on the Tuesday of that same week, something arrived at my door that I had not expected. My ex-girlfriend, Clara, standing on the landing with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at me with the particular expression of someone who has driven 4 hours and is not entirely sure what to say when they arrive. Here is where the power structure of the marriage undergoes its final, complete inversion, and where the story reveals the dependency loops that had kept both characters in their respective positions for so long. For 7 years, the relational dynamic between Elliot and Renata operated on an implicit but clearly structured power differential. Renata held the career prestige, the social authority, the narrative control. Elliot held the domestic infrastructure and the emotional labor, resources that are functionally essential but culturally undervalued, which meant they produced no visible power. This is a common asymmetry in long-term partnerships, and it persists partly because the person in the lower visibility role often derives enough identity stability from being needed that they do not interrogate the arrangement. The phone calls after the party reveal something critical about what Renata's power had actually been built on: Elliot's compliance. The calls, 3 of them, escalating in emotional register, are not the behavior of someone who has lost a relationship. They are the behavior of someone who has lost a mechanism of control and is trying urgently to restore it. Her text, "You had no right to do that," is not about the party. It is about the fundamental rupture in the arrangement. He acted without her permission, in a way she could not have anticipated, and the consequences are now outside her capacity to manage. The HR investigation is the story's clearest illustration of interconnected consequences. Renata had managed Marcus relationally the way she managed everything, through selective disclosure and controlled narrative. What she had not accounted for was the institutional layer, a conduct policy that does not care about narrative, only about documented facts. This is the specific vulnerability of people who have over-relied on impression management. Facts, when they surface in institutional contexts, cannot be reframed. Most psychologically significant is the Sunday conversation's final exchange. Renata's question, "Was it always going to end like this?" And Elliot's response, "I don't know when it ended. I know when I noticed," encapsulates the entire relational tragedy in 2 sentences. Marriages do not typically end at a single dramatic moment. They end gradually, in the accumulation of small distances and unaddressed truths, until the gap is too wide to pretend to cross. Elliot had simply been the last to stop pretending. Clara's arrival at the end of this section introduces a new relational possibility, but more importantly, it reframes the story's emotional trajectory. This is no longer primarily about what was lost. It is about what was always still there, waiting to be reclaimed. Clara and I had not spoken in 9 years. We had ended things in a way that felt, at the time, inevitable. One of those breakups that happens not because of cruelty or betrayal, but because two people are not quite ready to be the people each other needs, and parting seems like the only honest thing to do. She had moved to Glasgow. I had stayed in the city, met Renata at a professional event 6 months later, and begun the process of becoming someone I would spend the next 7 years slowly unrecognizing. She stood in the doorway with her coat on and her hair shorter than I remembered, and something in her expression that was both tentative and certain in the particular combination that people who have made a decision wear when they finally act on it. "You drove 4 hours," I said. 4.5, with traffic. She looked past me into the apartment, at the boxes, the cleared surfaces, the absence of Renata's accumulated presence. "You're in the middle of something." "I'm at the end of something," I said, which might be the same thing. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with Renata's tablet 2 weeks earlier, and she told me that she had followed what happened, not obsessively, but that it had filtered through mutual connections, and that when she heard about the party and the speech and the quiet, methodical way I had handled it, something had shifted for her. She had written me a letter a year ago that she never sent. She had found it while clearing out her flat when she moved back to the city. She had moved back 3 months ago, a fact I did not know, and it had made her think that maybe the things you don't say have a way of accumulating interest. She put the letter on the table. I read it. It was honest in the way that things written without the expectation of being read often are. She wrote that she had left because she could see me beginning to fold, beginning to make myself smaller for a set of choices she could tell were not mine, and that she had been too young and too uncertain to know how to say that in a way that might help rather than wound. She wrote that she was sorry for leaving without being clearer, that she had thought about it more than she expected to. I folded the letter back along its creases. "Why didn't you send it?" "Because I thought it was too late." She looked at me steadily. "I'm not sure it is now." We did not make any decisions that afternoon. Clara is not a person who makes decisions in an afternoon, and I had just finished dismantling one life and was not ready to begin constructing another one's narrative on day one of its possibility. But we talked until dark about the city, about her work. She was a documentary editor. I had not known that. About Glasgow and the differences. About the graphic novel, which she asked to read and to which I said yes. She left at 8. At the door she said, "I'm not here to rescue you, Elliot. You don't need that." "I know," I said. "Good." She smiled, briefly but completely. "Call me when the next chapter is finished." I did, 12 days later. She came over on a Saturday afternoon and read 40 new pages on the sofa while I made coffee and moved through the apartment with the particular ease of a person inhabiting a space that has finally become, simply and entirely, their own. 2 months after the party, I signed a development agreement with the Edinburgh Collective. It was not a fortune. It was a modest advance against a realistic timeline. But it was real, which is the only criterion that had ever mattered to me and that I had temporarily mislaid. I gave notice at the UX job. My manager said she was sorry to lose me. I thanked her and meant it. The divorce was finalized on a gray Thursday in February. Patricia's office smelled of good coffee and neutral professionalism. I signed where she indicated. The drive home took 20 minutes and was entirely unremarkable. That evening, I made dinner for one. Not the elaborate photographed kind, just pasta with olive oil and chili and a glass of red wine, and sat at the table by the window and watched the street settle into its ordinary evening rhythms. A man walking a dog. A couple arguing gently over something invisible. A cyclist in yellow. I felt no particular drama. Only the quiet, substantial weight of being exactly where I was supposed to be, having arrived there by the only route available, the one that required me to stop pretending the other routes were passable. Clara and I had dinner 3 weeks after that. We did not call it a date. We called it Thursday. It became a recurring Thursday, and then Thursdays and Sundays, and then something that did not require a label because it was simply, already, its own thing. The graphic novel was finished 14 months later. The first print run was modest. The second was not. I did not think often about Renata, in the way that you do not often think about the weather of a season that is fully past. When I did, it was without bitterness, which surprised me at first and then did not. Bitterness requires continued investment. I had reinvested elsewhere, in things that returned something. The accounting was not complicated. What I thought about, sometimes, in the particular quiet of early mornings before Clara woke, was the moment I stood up from that table at the rooftop party and said what I said. Not with pride, exactly. More with the retrospective recognition of how close I had come to not saying it. How close I had come to absorbing that, too. Filing it with the other silences, carrying it home in my navy jacket, and adding it to the weight I had been gradually accumulating for 7 years. I had said it. I had walked out. And the door had been, at last, an exit rather than another room in the same house. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in the end, everything. The final part of Elliot's story is not about resolution in the conventional narrative sense. It does not provide a triumphant reversal or a cleanly earned happiness. What it provides is something more psychologically authentic and more durable, a return to self. The central psychological event of Part 6 is not the legal finalization of the divorce or the publishing deal or even the rekindling of connection with Clara. It is the pasta dinner for one on the gray February evening after the papers are signed. Elliot eating alone by the window, watching the street, feeling no particular drama. This moment is psychologically enormous precisely because it is ordinary. The ability to inhabit an ordinary moment without anxiety, without the compulsive project of managing someone else's needs or expectations, without the background hum of a relationship that demands continuous self-erasure. This is the marker of genuine psychological restoration. The story of Elliot's inner conflict, traced across all 6 parts, is fundamentally a story about identity foreclosure, the gradual narrowing of a person's sense of self in response to relational pressure until they occupy only the dimensions of themselves that are deemed acceptable by the other. The graphic novel closed and abandoned after a single dismissive question. The photography stopped. The creative work suspended. The ambitions folded and stored. Identity foreclosure does not announce itself. It happens incrementally, in small social moments, in the accumulation of accommodations that each seem reasonable in isolation. Clara's role in the resolution is psychologically precise. She is not a romantic rescue. She is explicit about this, and Elliot receives the clarification with ease, which itself signals his recovery. She functions instead as a mirror of prior self, a person who knew him before the foreclosure and who is therefore able to reflect back an image of him that predates the damage. This is therapeutically significant. Recovery from long-term identity suppression often requires external evidence that the suppressed self existed and was real. Clara provides that evidence not through sentiment, but through practical engagement. She reads the novel. She treats the creative work as real. She asks about the next chapter. The novel's eventual publication is not a fairy tale ending. It is a consequence, the natural, logical consequence of a person who retrieved what was genuinely his and did the work required to bring it to completion. The accounting, as Elliot notes, is not complicated. Investment, return. He had simply been investing in the wrong account for 7 years. What remains in the story's final image? Early morning quiet, Clara still asleep, Elliot thinking about the party, is a man who has done the hardest thing. Exchanged the comfort of a false story for the difficulty of a true one, and discovered that the true one, however harder, was the only one worth living. Elliot and Renata's marriage did not collapse at the rooftop party. It collapsed in the 11 months of messages never deleted, in the 7 years of dinners never acknowledged, in the 200 pages of a graphic novel closed after a single dismissive question, in the thousands of small moments where one person reached toward the other and found the gesture converted, quietly and without malice, into evidence of irrelevance. The party was not a cause. It was a disclosure, the moment the accumulated pressure of invisible surrenders became visible to both people simultaneously. This is the accumulation effect in its most recognizable form. The way relationships erode not through dramatic ruptures, but through the steady pressure of small, unaddressed truths. Each individual event, an introduction not made, a joke at Elliot's expense, a calendar entry not deleted, a creative aspiration not taken seriously, was survivable in isolation. Together, across years, they constructed something structural, a relational architecture in which one person's diminishment had become load-bearing. Renata's psychology throughout this story is not monstrous. This is important to name, because the temptation in narratives of betrayal is to simplify the betrayer into a villain, and villainy lets us off the analytical hook. Renata was a person who had built her entire sense of self around the management of impressions and the maintenance of narrative control. In a relationship with a partner who accommodated everything, she had unconsciously but systematically expanded to fill the available space. She did not set out to erase Elliot. She simply never encountered a version of him that required her to take him seriously, because he had removed that version from view in order to keep the peace. Her contempt, evidenced most clearly in the shared mockery with Marcus, was the symptom of a person who had stopped perceiving their partner as a full human being. This is the final stage of accommodation creep's consequence. When one person accommodates sufficiently and consistently, the other person, operating on behavioral feedback rather than conscious cruelty, eventually updates their model of who that person is. Elliot had trained Renata, without intending to underestimate him. Marcus's role in the story is secondary but instructive. He represented not a passion but a preference, a version of social and professional interaction that Renata found more energizing than her marriage. Affairs of this type, organizational, comfortable, conducted in the margins of an already distant marriage, are rarely about love. They are about the restoration of a self-image that the primary relationship has stopped providing. Marcus reflected back the Renata she wanted to be: sharp, sophisticated, privately superior. That reflection was more valuable to her than what Elliot offered, which was genuine, patient, unflattering love. The pivot point of the story, the moment the pattern irrevocably breaks, is not the speech at the party. It is earlier. It is the moment in the apartment, the morning after the rooftop, when Elliot picks up the tablet and decides to look. This is the first decision in 7 years that is made entirely in his own interest, without reference to what Renata needs or wants or would prefer. It is small. It is quiet. But it is the crack in a dam that has been under pressure for years, and once cracked, structures of that kind do not hold. What follows? The documentation, the legal consultation, the party, the speech, the publishing email, the letter from Clara, is not a revenge arc. It is a recovery arc. Each step moves Elliot not toward Renata's destruction, but away from his own. The graphic novel is the clearest evidence. It predates the crisis. It was never about her. And its completion is the measure of how much of himself he was able to retrieve. The final image of the story, a man eating pasta alone, watching a street, feeling ordinary, is the resolution of an identity crisis that the crisis itself made possible. The marriage, for all its damage, produced the rupture that freed him. The rooftop party, for all its humiliation, gave him the one thing 7 years of peace had not: a reason, irreducible and undeniable, to stop performing a version of himself that did not exist. The universal lesson embedded in this story is not about betrayal, though betrayal is its occasion. It is about the cost of chronic self-erasure in the service of relational maintenance, and about the paradox that the self you surrender in order to keep a relationship is precisely the self that made you worth loving in the first place. Elliot lost a marriage. He recovered a person. The accounting, as he notes, is not complicated, but it takes most of us longer than it should to learn to do it.